And so this is why de Gaulle, the representative of French imperialism, suddenly becomes the liberator of the African colonies. But when the sting in the tail was when they agreed this formal independence, they forced, or they used many ways to induce the leaders of these countries to sign up to what they referred to as cooperation agreements. Independence was to go hand in hand with cooperation. The imperialists explained that in the modern world, a single nation, African or otherwise, can't survive. Otherwise, they'll be swallowed up by the greater powers. That's why we all need to stick together as a nice family, a community, they called it, in order to protect and develop each other. And so this is the form the development took. First of all, upon independence, the whole of Africa was balkanized by the European powers, including France, not only France. West Africa was carved up into a number of arbitrary, artificial, weak states. To give you an example, Burkina Faso has 60 ethnic groups in it. The main ethnic group, the Mossi, is actually less than half of the population. Many of these ethnic groups actually straddle a number of national boundaries and cross over these boundaries, irrespective of the wish of the state. And at the same time, Burkina Faso has always been very closely linked economically with the Ivory Coast. When they were all just one big French colony, Burkina Faso was treated effectively as a cheap labour reserve for plantations in the Ivory Coast, which, because of its coastal position, it was more commercially viable. All of a sudden, upon independence, that's cut off. So the Burkinabe economy, which had been left almost entirely undeveloped, is all of a sudden supposed to maintain its own state apparatus, which is a finished recipe for indebtedness and independence. That was the point, by the way. That wasn't an accident. Cameroon has 200 different languages in it. These are not natural borders, as the imperialists in Europe would talk about. Just to give you one more example, Niger and Nigeria got a different name, very simple, sound very oddly very similar. The Hausa ethnic group is the biggest ethnic group in Niger. It's also the biggest ethnic group in northern Nigeria. They consider themselves the same people, same language. They have a different official language and a straight line border. Why? Because they happen to be dominated by France and Britain in the past. The entire continent has been carved up like that in order to make it weak and independent. And then the French insisted that these states that didn't even exist until the night before were to negotiate with France on an individual basis. They were not to negotiate collectively en bloc. The content of these cooperation agreements was as follows. First of all, economic cooperation, of course, for the stability and development of the Africans, of course. That was what they said anyway. The first was they were all going to have a common currency, which, as we know from the euro, is an incredibly progressive and egalitarian measure. The purpose of this, and actually the content of it is quite similar. First of all, the pillars of this common currency was that the CFA franc. The CFA franc was created in colonial times. It was created in the 1940s. It stood for Colonie Française d'Afrique. They kept the initials and just changed it to Communauté Financière d'Afrique. So they basically did a quick, no, it didn't even change the initials, just changed the name. And all of a sudden they have this common currency, which is pegged at a 2-to-1 ratio to France. The ratio was determined unilaterally by the French Treasury and the French state. That was a fixed proportion. Free movement of capital between France and its former colonies was guaranteed. Again, I would ask the question, who had all the capital in that arrangement? That effectively meant that French capital could go in and it could extract the profits with no capital controls whatsoever. It also meant that it had a guarantee of reserves. So the two central banks that were set up in Africa, one in West Africa, one in Central Africa, they had a guarantee from the French Treasury that if they ever ran out of CFA francs, they would be immediately transferred by the French Treasury. That's very kind, except in return, they had to deposit all of their foreign exchange reserves in an account controlled by the French Treasury. So the French state controlled the money supply of 14 different African countries. Later, that was reduced to half of their foreign exchange. And only recently, I think in 2021, Macron and the French Parliament announced that they didn't have to deposit any of their foreign currency exchange. And they were also going to change the name to the ECO, coming from ECOWAS, the regional bloc. However, the unilaterally determined ratio and the free movement of capital was to remain. The impact on this, as you can imagine, has massively held back economic development, even on a capitalist basis, in the region concerned. First of all, the CFA franc was overvalued related to the franc. What that means is imports from France were relatively cheap, whereas exports from the CFA franc countries, not only to France, but to other African countries that don't have the same currency, were too expensive. So it meant that indigenous industries could not compete with France or even their African neighbours like Nigeria, for instance. It meant that domestic industry was completely abandoned, really. It also meant that they didn't have a control over their money supply. They couldn't print money. And they couldn't devalue their currency to become more competitive because the rate was fixed. So similar to what we saw in Greece under the euro, they had to carry out a process of what's called internal devaluation. That means cutting wages, austerity, in order to try and maintain competitivity. The last kind of kick in the face is in 1994, France unilaterally devalued the CFA franc by half. And so overnight, all of the goods that were imported into these countries doubled in price, including staples like rice and so on. And the cost of borrowing, which was in CFA francs, also increased literally overnight. This has led to a situation in which these parceled up, weak economies, all maintaining their own state apparatus with no economic independence whatsoever, went into a cycle of indebtedness. The only way that they could cover their budget deficits from year on year is to borrow, particularly from French banks at interest.